The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled amidst the rolling meadows and prim hedgerows of the English countryside, had seen its fair share of gossip over the years. To the casual eye, it was the epitome of English respectability, roses clambering over cottage walls, the church bell tolling dutifully on Sunday mornings, and the faint aroma of scones wafting from Mrs. Price Ridley's kitchen window. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple often remarked to herself, human nature is much the same whether in the great cities or in a quiet village, merely with fewer places to hide. On an unusually warm afternoon in late May, Miss Marple sat in her neat parlour, darning a pair of her nephew Raymond's socks, sent to her in a rather battered parcel with a note confessing that his housekeeper had quite given up on mending them. She worked with the patient, precise rhythm that she found conducive to thought. Out of her window, she could see the pink blossoms of the hawthorn tree trembling in the light breeze. Everything seemed peaceful, as though the village were basking in the calm of early summer. Yet she had long learned to mistrust such stillness. A sharp rap on the door broke her reverie. Mary, her maid of all work, entered with a flustered expression. "It's Inspector Slack, ma'am. Says he'd like a word, if you please." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Inspector Slack of the county police was not a man inclined to make social calls. He was brisk, efficient, and possessed of an officious manner that often grated on the gentler sensibilities of St. Mary Mead's ladies. His unexpected visit promised something rather out of the ordinary. "Do show him in, Mary," said Miss Marple, folding away her needlework with delicate precision. The inspector entered, a sturdy man with a square jaw and an expression perpetually hovering between impatience and irritation. He removed his hat, mopped his brow, and cleared his throat. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. I trust I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple replied gently, her eyes twinkling. "I always think it best to welcome visitors with a cup of tea. Will you take one?" Slack hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. Perhaps I will. It's been a long day already." As Mary went to fetch the tea, Miss Marple regarded him quietly. Years of observing her fellow villagers had taught her that people revealed themselves most in moments when they believed no one was watching. Slack's fidgeting hands and tightened jaw betrayed a man under pressure. "You have news, I think," Miss Marple said softly, as if remarking on the weather. Slack gave a short laugh. "You've the uncanny knack of always knowing more than you should, Miss Marple." "Yes, I do. I'm in something of a tight corner. One of my informants has turned up dead." Miss Marple set down the teacup she had just lifted, her expression serene though her mind sharpened instantly. "How very distressing. An accident?" "That's what I've been told," Slack replied grimly. "But I'm not so sure. Fellow by the name of George Pritchard. Kept himself to himself, lived in a small cottage by the river. He wasn't popular, rum sort, if you take my meaning, but he gave us useful information now and then about certain, shall we say, unsavory activities in the district. Poaching rings, petty theft, that kind of thing. He had a nose for trouble, and now he's been found at the bottom of the quarry road, his bicycle smashed beside him." "How very unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple. "A fall, then. That's how it looks. But Pritchard was a steady rider, not given to carelessness, and only last week he told me he had something big. His word, not mine. Said he'd pass it along when he was ready. I thought it was just another of his tales, but now—" He shook his head. "Well, let's just say I can't discount foul play." Mary returned with the tea tray. Miss Marple poured with practiced grace, the delicate china cups clinking softly. She let the inspector collect his thoughts before she spoke again. "And do you have suspects, Inspector?" Slack gave a short bark of laughter. "Half the village, if you believe the talk. Pritchard wasn't a man to make friends. He drank too much, pried into others' affairs, and wasn't above a spot of blackmail, or so I've heard. Truth is, Miss Marple, he might have stumbled upon something that made him a target. But what and who? Well, that's the puzzle." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful. "I have often found, Inspector, that in cases of sudden death, one must not look only at the event itself, but also at the little undercurrents surrounding it. People's quarrels, old resentments, whispered confidences. I dare say you will find St. Mary Mead is not so tranquil as it appears." Slack grunted. "That's why I thought of you, Miss Marple. You notice things, quiet things that the police might overlook." He set down his cup with a decisive clink. "I'd be obliged if you kept your eyes open. Unofficially, of course, and if you hear anything at all, you'll let me know." "Of course, Inspector," said Miss Marple, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. That very evening, news of George Pritchard's death spread like wildfire through the village. At the post office, Mrs. Hartnell declared that she had always known he would come to a bad end. At the Blue Boar Inn, Mr. Tom Riley hinted darkly about unpaid debts and dangerous company. And at the vicarage, Mrs. Clement shook her head with genteel sorrow, remarking that one should never speak ill of the dead, though poor Mr. Pritchard did make it rather difficult. Miss Marple, meanwhile, attended to her knitting circle with her usual quiet smile. Yet behind her mild blue eyes, her mind was already sifting, sorting, and weaving together the small, seemingly insignificant details that so often led to the truth. She recalled George Pritchard well, a wary man with darting eyes, perpetually glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting pursuit. He had lived alone since his sister's death some years earlier, and though he worked odd jobs around the village, he was rarely trusted. There had been talk of quarrels, particularly with Mr. Edmund Rowley, the wealthy squire who lived at Mill House, and with Mrs. Beatrice Lawson, whose poultry had been mysteriously disappearing. And then there was young Clara Evans, the schoolmistress, who was rumoured to have received unwanted attentions from Pritchard. She had denied it with dignity, but Miss Marple had noticed the flush of discomfort in the girl's cheeks when his name was mentioned. Yes, there were undercurrents, many of them. The following morning, Miss Marple decided to take a gentle stroll towards the quarry road. At her age, such walks were often regarded as a harmless pastime, though she found them infinitely useful. People rarely minded what they said in front of an elderly lady, who appeared to be more interested in wildflowers than in conversation. She paused at the bend in the lane where Pritchard had supposedly met his end. The verge was muddy, and the bicycle's tire tracks were still faintly visible. She crouched delicately, examining the impressions. They seemed to veer abruptly to the right, as though forced. And there, half hidden beneath a clump of nettles, was a small object glinting dully in the sunlight. Miss Marple bent closer and retrieved it with care, a metal cufflink, engraved with the initials E.R. Her lips pursed ever so slightly. Edmund Rowley, the squire, a pillar of the community, proud of his family's name and estate. But what business had his cufflink here, near the scene of a death? Replacing the object carefully in her handbag, Miss Marple straightened and continued her walk, her mind alight with possibilities. By the week's end, Inspector Slack had his hands full. The inquest had returned an open verdict, the coroner declaring that while Pritchard's injuries were consistent with a fall, there remained insufficient evidence to state conclusively that it was accidental. The villagers, meanwhile, had seized upon the mystery with relish. Suspicions flew freely, and each household seemed to harbour its own theory. At tea in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple listened with polite attention as the ladies speculated. "My dear," exclaimed Dolly Bantry, her eyes sparkling, "if you ask me, that man was pushed. Pritchard knew far too much about people's private business. Why, only last month he hinted he could tell me something about Arthur's investments that would interest me." "Imagine such impertinence." Mrs. Price, Ridley sniffed. "He was nothing but a nuisance. I dare say some poor soul simply lost patience." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "Human nature, you know, has a way of repeating itself. I once knew a gardener in Littlehampton who came to grief in rather similar circumstances. He too had a habit of prying where he ought not, and in the end it was not his enemies who brought about his downfall, but his supposed friends." Her remark was met with a ripple of curiosity, but she did not elaborate. Instead, she tucked away the knowledge like a squirrel hiding a nut for later. For Miss Marple understood that in such matters, patience was everything. And so, the quiet village of St. Mary Mead found itself once more the stage for a drama of human weakness, folly, and crime. Beneath the tranquil surface of its gardens and tea parties lay secrets, grudges, and fears waiting to be uncovered. And at the heart of it all, knitting serenely in her parlour, was Miss Jane Marple, already piecing together the threads that would, in time, reveal the truth behind the murder of Inspector Slack's informant. The funeral of George Pritchard was held on a grey and unsettled morning, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the little churchyard of St. Mary Mead. Though Pritchard had not been well loved, curiosity drew a respectable number of villagers to the service. Miss Marple attended, as was her custom, not out of sentiment, but because she knew funerals to be excellent barometers of village feeling. Who wept, who scowled, who stood apart, all these little details spoke volumes. From her discreet position near the back pew she observed. Edmund Rowley the squire was present, his tall frame stiff, his mouth set in grim lines. He murmured briefly with the vicar, then took a place alone, his eyes avoiding the congregation. Mrs. Beatrice Lawson, stout and florid, clutched her black veil as though it might flutter away, her lips pursed in a manner suggesting both indignation and satisfaction. Young Clara Evans, pale and self-possessed, sat very still, though Miss Marple noted the nervous movement of her hands upon her lap, and behind them, loitering with poorly disguised disinterest, was Tom Riley of the Blue Boar, a man who knew far more than he ever told. After the burial, groups formed in hushed clusters. Miss Marple lingered by the lich gate, allowing herself to overhear as much as possible. Mrs. Hartnell whispered to Mrs. Price Ridley that Pritchard had been menace, and that it was only a matter of time before someone stopped him. The tone was one of vindication rather than sorrow. Edmund Rowley passed close by, his boots striking the gravel with impatient force. Miss Marple allowed herself to drop her handkerchief, and as he stooped, reluctantly, to retrieve it, she murmured, "Such a sad business, Mr. Rowley. It must be a strain upon you, with all your responsibilities in the parish." His eyes flickered, just for a moment, betraying something, annoyance, perhaps, or unease. "Yes, quite," he said curtly. "Pritchard's affairs are no concern of mine. Good day, Miss Marple." He thrust the handkerchief back to her and strode away. Miss Marple's mind ticked over gently. A small discourtesy, perhaps, but she had long believed that discourtesy often revealed more of the truth than politeness. The following afternoon, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, his manner brisk and somewhat harassed. "Thought I'd give you an update, Miss Marple. Nothing definite, mind. Pritchard's cottage has been searched. Papers, odds and ends, nothing of consequence." "But," he hesitated, lowering his voice. There was a scrap of a note in his pocket. Torn but legible enough. It said, "Meet me by the quarry road after dusk. Come alone." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. How very intriguing. And the handwriting? Couldn't say. No signature. Could be anyone. Slack scowled. "And of course, no one in the village knows a thing about it. Or so they claim." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "People rarely admit to such meetings, Inspector. But I dare say the truth is never so well hidden as it seems. One must simply ask in the right way." The right way, in Miss Marple's mind, was rarely the direct way. She began with Mrs. Beatrice Lawson, under the pretext of admiring her roses. The Lawson garden was famed in the district, though Mrs. Lawson herself was more often remembered for her formidable manner. "It is extraordinary," Miss Marple remarked mildly, "how the roses flourish this year, almost as though they sensed the coming of summer eftes." Mrs. Lawson, preening, puffed out her chest. "Indeed, Miss Marple. Of course, I do devote rather a lot of time to them. More than I can say for others in this village." She gave a sniff. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft and reflective, "one is reminded that beauty often attracts unwelcome attention. I recall you once mentioned poor Mr. Pritchard troubling your poultry." Mrs. Lawson's face darkened. "That man was a pest, forever lurking about, asking questions, making insinuations. He as good as accused me of cheating at the flower show last year. Said he had proof of some nonsense about fertilizer." "Proof? Ha! Proof can be such a dangerous word," murmured Miss Marple. "And did he ever show you such proof?" Mrs. Lawson hesitated, then shook her head sharply. "No, but he meant mischief, I'm sure of it." She pursed her lips, glaring at a particularly innocent rose bush as though it had conspired against her. Miss Marple tucked the remark away like a stitch in her knitting. Proof, or at least the threat of it, seemed to follow George Pritchard wherever he went. Her next call was at the schoolhouse. Clara Evans received her kindly, though with an air of nervous tension that Miss Marple did not miss. "How good of you to spare a moment for an old woman," Miss Marple said warmly, as Clara poured tea. "I so admire the patience one must have to teach children. It requires, I think, both strength and gentleness." Clara smiled faintly. "It can be demanding, Miss Marple, but rewarding too." "Demanding, yes. I dare say, especially when one is troubled by outside distractions. Young men, perhaps, being over-attentive." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she set down the teapot. "If you mean George Pritchard, Miss Marple, I assure you there was nothing of the sort. He spoke to me once or twice, nothing more. He was unpleasant. I avoided him." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "I quite understand, my dear. Such attentions, even when not wanted, can weigh heavily, and sometimes when one refuses them, the man in question may turn spiteful." Clara's lips pressed together, her eyes flashing. "Yes, he threatened to spread stories about me, false ones. Said he could ruin my reputation. I told him to do his worst. She drew a breath, regaining composure. I am not ashamed, Miss Marple, but it frightened me at the time. Miss Marple reached across with a reassuring pat of the hand. You are very brave, my dear, and you have nothing to fear from me. But it is useful, I think, to know these little things. They form part of a larger picture. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected on the schoolmistress's words. Another grievance, another motive, yet Clara had the look of a woman more afraid than angry. Fear rarely leads to murder, but it can lead to concealment. 2 evenings later, Miss Marple encountered Tom Riley outside the Blue Boar. He greeted her with his usual roguish grin. "Well now, Miss Marple, out for your evening constitutional. You'll be putting us younger folk to shame." "Exercise, Mr. Riley, is a tonic at any age," she replied serenely, "and one often sees such interesting things whilst walking. Why, only last week I came upon the most curious little scene near the quarry road." She let the words dangle suggestively. Riley's grin faltered. "Oh, and what was that?" "Oh, nothing of importance, I dare say. Merely some tracks and a bit of disturbance." "I wondered who might have been about that evening." Riley's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not me, Miss Marple. I was here at the inn all night, as half the village can tell you." The Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Indeed, how very reassuring, though one sometimes finds that alibis are not always as solid as they appear." He laughed, but the sound was forced. "You've a sharp tongue for an old lady, and a sharper memory," Miss Marple said mildly. By the end of the week, the village was seething with speculation. Miss Marple, knitting serenely in her parlour, had collected a number of threads. Edmund Rowley, proud and secretive, whose cufflink had been found near the scene. Mrs. Lawson, affronted by accusations of dishonesty and threatened by proof. Clara Evans, bullied by unwelcome attentions and slanderous threats. Tom Riley, the innkeeper with shifting eyes and a slippery tongue. Each had reason to wish Pritchard ill. Each had the opportunity to lure him to the quarry road at dusk. And yet, as Miss Marple knew so well, murder was rarely as simple as motive and means. It was human nature that held the key. The little vanities, fears and grudges that revealed themselves in ways the guilty never intended. And so, with her needles clicking and her mind as sharp as ever, Miss Marple prepared to watch, to listen, and to wait, for the investigation had only just begun, and she was certain that beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, darker currents still waited to be uncovered. The summer fete at St. Mary Mead was always an anticipated occasion, drawing villagers together for raffles, cakes and gossip under the bunting, draped green. This year, however, a certain unease hung over the proceedings. George Pritchard's death was still a raw subject, and though outwardly all went as usual, the vicar judging sponge cakes, children racing in sacks, Miss Marple noted the guarded glances, the whispered conversations. People could not quite keep murder from their minds. She herself had volunteered, as ever, to mind the stall of knitted goods. Her needles clicked steadily as she sat behind a neat display of baby clothes and mittens, watching the ebb and flow of the villagers. It was a prime position, affording her a view of almost everything. It did not escape her notice that Edmund Rowley kept largely to himself, standing stiffly near the refreshment tent, speaking curtly when spoken to. Mrs. Lawson bustled about officiously, ensuring her Victoria sponge was properly admired. Clara Evans shepherded children with quiet efficiency, though her pale face betrayed strain. Tom Riley laughed loudly with a group of men, though his eyes flickered now and then to Rowley with something very like weariness. It was in the midst of this genteel bustle that the first twist revealed itself. At 3:30, Inspector Slack appeared, moving through the crowd with his characteristic bulldog determination. He paused at Miss Marple's stall, doffing his hat. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Thought I might find you here." "You are always most diligent, Inspector," she said warmly. "Have you news?" "Not exactly news, but something's come to light." Pritchard had a small notebook hidden in his cottage chimney. "Just found it this morning. Full of scrawls, half legible, but one entry stands out. Meeting at quarry. Threats, proof in pocket." Miss Marple's needles did not falter, though her eyes narrowed slightly. Would suggest Edmund Rowley, perhaps. Exactly. And now half the village will think Rowley did him in. But it's too neat, too obvious. Slack shook his head. "I don't like it." "Nor do I," Miss Marple agreed softly. Human nature is rarely so obliging. Later that afternoon a small commotion arose near the tea tent. Clara Evans had fainted. She was revived quickly, pale and trembling, insisting she was merely overcome by the heat. Yet Miss Marple, ever observant, noted that just before she swooned, Tom Riley had handed her a folded scrap of paper. A chance accident, or a deliberate shock? Miss Marple stored the observation carefully. That evening she sat in her parlor and pieced her thoughts together. The notebook accusing Edmund Rowley, Clara's collapse, Riley's mysterious note, each detail fit, but in a way that seemed almost too perfect. She took out the cufflink found near the quarry road. An expensive piece, monogrammed, clearly belonging to Rowley. Yet why would a man so proud of his position leave behind such an obvious clue, unless it had been planted? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Yes, she had seen such things before. When the guilty sought to shift suspicion elsewhere, they often overplayed their hand. The next morning, she decided to call upon Edmund Rowley at Mill House. The squire received her in a study lined with leather-bound volumes, his manner courteous but cool. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "It is only neighborly interest, Mr. Rowley," she replied, settling herself. "The village is much disturbed by Mr. Pritchard's death. And of course, your name has been mentioned, unfortunately." Rowley's jaw tightened. "I am aware of the gossip. It is monstrous. Yes, I had quarrels with Pritchard. The man was a blackmailer. He came to me with insinuations about my estate accounts. Utter nonsense. I paid him nothing, I assure you. I told him to leave my property or face consequences." Miss Marple regarded him with calm eyes. "And did he threaten to reveal these insinuations publicly?" "Yes. He said he had proof. But it was all lies." He struck the desk with his fist. "Do you suppose I would lower myself to murder over the likes of George Pritchard?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I should never suppose, Mr. Rowley. I merely observe. And I could not help but notice that one of your cufflinks was found near the quarry road." Rowley's face drained of color. "Impossible. I lost a cufflink last week in the garden. If it turned up by the quarry, someone must have planted it." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. "And that, I think, is most interesting." Her next visit was to Mrs. Lawson, who welcomed her with tea and an avalanche of complaints. That man Riley, forever snooping about. And Clara Evans. Well, she may look innocent, but you mark my words, she knows more than she lets on. As for Edmund Rowley, I wouldn't be surprised if he's up to his ears in trouble. Miss Marple listened placidly, stirring her tea. "And yet, Mrs. Lawson, I cannot help but wonder, if Pritchard had proof of irregularities at the flower show, might he not have used it against you?" Mrs. Lawson's teacup rattled in its saucer. "Proof? Sure, mere bluster. And if he had threatened me, well, I should have told my husband to thrash him." Miss Marple allowed the denial to pass. Yet the tremor in Mrs. Lawson's hand had spoken volumes. The real surprise came the next day. Inspector Slack called again, his expression grim. "There's been a development, Miss Marple. A fire at Pritchard's cottage last night. Someone tried to burn it down. We got there in time to save most of it, but some papers are gone. Deliberate, I'd say. Someone wanted something destroyed." "How very curious," Miss Marple said softly. "Fires, you know, are most enlightening, not for what they consume, but for what remains." Slack gave her a keen look. "You've something in mind, haven't you?" "Perhaps," she replied mildly, "but one must be patient. The truth has a way of revealing itself when people think themselves safe." That afternoon Miss Marple walked again near the quarry. She paused, as if admiring the wildflowers, when she noticed a scrap of charred paper caught against the hedge. Carefully, she retrieved it. Though scorched, one word remained legible: Riley. Her lips pressed together. Tom Riley, then, was not merely an idle gossip. Pritchard had written his name, and someone had tried very hard to ensure such records vanished. By the week's end, the village buzzed with renewed speculation. Suspicion now swung wildly between Edmund Rowley, Mrs. Lawson, and Tom Riley, while Clara Evans hovered on the edges of pity and doubt. Miss Marple, knitting serenely, had her own quiet theory. She had seen, in other cases, how guilt cloaked itself in indignation, how innocence stumbled clumsily in defense. And she felt sure now that one among them had spun a careful web of deceit, laying false trails for others to follow. Yet still, one piece was missing, the something big, that Pritchard had claimed to know. Until she uncovered that secret, the truth would remain elusive. And so, as the twilight deepened over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared herself. The twists had only begun, and she was certain another revelation was imminent. One that would bring the real culprit into sharper focus, though not without further danger. The days following the fire at Pritchard's cottage were marked by an odd lull in the village. Outwardly, all was calm. Church bells rang as usual. Mrs. Price, Ridley scolded her maid over the silver, and the vicar prepared his sermon. But underneath unease lingered. People lowered their voices when speaking of the death, and glances were exchanged that held more suspicion than sympathy. Miss Marple, as ever, observed quietly. She had seen such lulls before, moments when guilt believed itself safe, when the guilty drew breath too soon. It was precisely then that truth most often revealed itself. She sat by her window one afternoon, knitting steadily, when Inspector Slack came striding up the path. His boots rang sharply against the stone, his manner harried. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "this business is getting worse. I've had Rowley in for questioning. He's furious, swears Pritchard was blackmailing him, yes, but insists he never went near the quarry road that night, and the cufflink, he says, must have been planted. He has witnesses that put him at Mill House after dusk, though not strong ones. Frankly, I don't know what to believe." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It is often so in these cases, Inspector. Appearances may be arranged, but character is far harder to disguise. Tell me, have you considered the matter of the note Pritchard received?" Slack frowned. "The one asking him to meet at the quarry?" "Yes. No signature. Useless scrap." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly. "The choice of meeting place, the request to come alone, those speak volumes. It suggests someone who knew Pritchard's habits, someone confident he would obey, and that, I think, narrows our field considerably." Slack gave her a keen look. "You've someone in mind, haven't you?" Miss Marple's needles clicked serenely. "Perhaps. But let us be patient. All in good time." That evening Miss Marple attended a small supper at the vicarage. The company included Mrs. Lawson, Edmund Rowley, and Clara Evans, along with the Clements. Conversation was polite, but the undercurrents were strong. Mrs. Lawson, with her usual officiousness, spoke loudly of her roses, pointedly ignoring Clara. Rowley was taciturn, drinking more wine than usual. Clara seemed pale and distracted, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple contributed only mild observations, yet she watched every flicker of expression. When Pritchard's name arose, Rowley's jaw clenched, Mrs. Lawson sniffed in disdain, and Clara flinched as though struck. It was Clara who most drew Miss Marple's attention. Later, when leaving, she contrived to fall into step with the schoolmistress. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you are overwrought. Would you permit an old woman to give you a word of comfort?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Miss Marple, I can't bear it. I keep thinking, if I had spoken out sooner, perhaps he would still be alive. But I was afraid." "Afraid of what, my dear?" "Of what he might say. He threatened to accuse me of things. Wicked lies. I thought no one would believe me. And now he is dead, and they will think I had reason to wish it so." Miss Marple took her hand. "Child, fear makes cowards of us all. But it also blinds us, remember. Those who shout loudest of proof often have none at all. Tell me, did Mr. Riley ever encourage you to keep silent?" The Clara started. "Mr. Riley? Why, yes, he told me not to fret, that no one would heed Pritchard. He said he would see to it. At the time I thought he meant comfort, but now I wonder." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. That was precisely the piece she had been waiting for. The following morning, she requested a private word with Inspector Slack. They sat in her parlor, the air fragrant with lavender. "Inspector," she began, "I believe we have all been looking the wrong way. The evidence against Mr. Rowley is too neat, far too neatly arranged. Cufflinks, notebooks, quarrels, it all points directly to him, and that is precisely why we must doubt it. In my experience, the truth rarely arranges itself so conveniently." Slack frowned. "So you think Rowley's innocent?" "Not innocent, perhaps. Merely not guilty of murder. His pride and temper may have led him to threaten Pritchard, but he is not a man to stoop to ambush. And Mrs. Lawson, she too, had motive, but she is bluster and indignation. A woman who would scold and shame, yes, but not lure a man to his death." Slack leaned forward. "Then who?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Consider Tom Riley, a man who moves easily among villagers, hearing much, saying little, a man who passes notes, who was named in Pritchard's papers, a man who, I suspect, was more deeply entangled in Pritchard's affairs than he pretends, and most telling, he is the sort who would think it clever to plant a cufflink and a notebook to direct suspicion elsewhere." The Slack's brows shot up. "Riley. But he runs the inn. Why would he risk it?" "Because, Inspector, Riley's livelihood gives him opportunity and temptation. Poaching rings, petty thefts, perhaps even smuggling. Such things thrive near an inn, with travellers coming and going. Pritchard likely discovered more than was safe, and when Pritchard hinted at something big, Riley knew his own secrets were about to be exposed. The Slack sat back heavily. By Jove, it fits. It all fits. Miss Marple smiled mildly. I think, Inspector, that if you were to press Mr. Riley, very gently, he might find his cleverness unravels. That evening, the trap was set. Inspector Slack arranged for Riley to be brought quietly to the station, under pretext of routine questioning. Miss Marple, invited to observe, sat quietly knitting in the corner as Slack began his blunt interrogation. At first, Riley laughed, mocking the suggestion. Me, murder Pritchard? Don't be daft. Everyone knows Rowley had it in for him. Funny, said Slack, because we've found your name in Pritchard's papers. And a witness saw you pass a note to Clara Evans the day of the FT. Care to explain? Riley's grin faltered. Just a friendly word. The girl was upset, that's all. Upset because you warned her to keep quiet. Slack pressed. Because you were afraid Pritchard had told her something. Beads of sweat broke across Riley's brow. Nonsense. She's a silly little schoolmistress, doesn't know anything. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Then, in her mild voice, she interjected. Oh, but she knew enough, Mr. Riley. Enough to frighten her into silence. You see, George Pritchard may have been a blackmailer, but he was also careless. He told Clara that he could ruin her, but in truth, what he had was not about her at all. It was about you, your dealings in stolen goods, perhaps, or your cozy arrangement with certain poachers. Riley sprang to his feet. That's a lie. Sit down, barked Slack. Miss Marple continued gently. You feared exposure, Mr. Riley, so you lured Pritchard to the quarry road, made it seem a cycling accident, and left behind a cufflink to point suspicion elsewhere. You thought yourself most clever, but cleverness is rarely so neat, and guilt always leaves a trace. In this case, a single charred scrap with your name. Riley's face twisted. For a long moment, he seemed about to brazen it out. Then, with a curse, he dropped his head into his hands. Blast him. He was going to ruin me. Said he'd told the police already. I couldn't let him. Inspector Slack exhaled sharply. That'll do, Riley. We've enough. When Riley had been led away, Slack turned to Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and grudging admiration. Well, Miss Marple, you've done it again. Saw straight through his tricks. You did. I don't know how you manage it. Miss Marple smiled, her needles never ceasing. Oh, Inspector, it is only observation. I have known many Tom Rileys in my time, men who mistake cunning for wisdom. But in the end it is always the small things, the faint tremor in a hand, the careless word, the scrap of paper, that betray them. Slack gave a short laugh. You make it sound so simple. Human nature. Miss Marple said serenely. Simple, infinitely varied in detail, perhaps, but always the same in essence. That night, as she sat by her window with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected quietly. The village would soon return to its tranquil rhythm. Gossip would linger, of course, but justice had been done, and calm would resume. Yet she knew well enough that beneath the roses and teacups, beneath the feftes and sermons, human weakness would continue its eternal dance, and when next it tripped into crime, she would be there. An old lady with sharp eyes and sharper intuition, watching, listening, and unraveling the truth. The autumn sun fell gently across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, painting the village in shades of amber and gold. Though the air still buzzed faintly with talk of Riley's arrest, a sense of calm was returning. Shopkeepers opened their shutters, children darted between hedgerows, and Mrs. Price, Ridley's maid, was seen airing rugs upon the line. Yet curiosity, as Miss Marple knew, never lay far beneath the surface of village tranquility. The people of St. Mary Mead were eager, desperately eager, for the full story. Rumour had already galloped ahead of fact. Some swore Riley was a smuggler, others whispered of secret passages beneath the inn, and still others, Price Ridley chief among them, insisted Clara Evans had lured Pritchard to his death out of desperation. It was therefore agreed that Inspector Slack, to forestall wilder speculation, should present the truth, and since Miss Marple was the true architect of that truth, she was invited to share her observations at a small gathering in the vicarage drawing-room. A village gathering, the room was well filled that evening. Reverend Clement and his wife Griselda poured tea with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Lawson swept in wearing her best pearls, her nose aloft. Rowley leaned heavily against the mantel, his jaw set, while Clara sat nervously by the fire, her hands twisting in her lap. Dr. Haydock was present too, and even Mrs. Price, Ridley, had come, determined not to miss the latest morsel. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair, small and unassuming, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. Inspector Slack stood beside her, shuffling his papers with uncharacteristic awkwardness. "My friends," Reverend Clement began, "we are gathered this evening in the hope of restoring calm to our parish, by speaking plainly of recent events. Inspector Slack has, with the invaluable assistance of Miss Marple, brought the matter to its conclusion. And so, without further delay, Inspector, if you please." A Slack cleared his throat. "Well, the long and short of it is, Riley killed Pritchard. No doubt about it. Thought he was being clever, planting evidence to frame Rowley, but Miss Marple here saw through the trick. Perhaps, Miss Marple, you'd care to explain in your own way." All eyes turned to her. She smiled modestly, folding her hands together. Miss Marple explains, "You are very kind, Inspector. But it was not difficult, really. One has only to observe human nature, which is, after all, the same whether in a great city or a small village. First, let us consider the death itself. At first glance it seemed a cycling accident. But Pritchard was not a careless man. He would not have chosen a dangerous road at dusk without good reason. The note requesting a meeting at the quarry was therefore crucial. Who would he obey so readily? Someone he trusted, perhaps even feared. Next, there was the matter of the cufflink and the notebook. Both pointed directly to Mr. Rowley. Too directly, I thought. For though Mr. Rowley's quarrels with Pritchard were well known, he is not, if I may say so, a subtle man. He speaks hotly, yes, but he does not plot in secret. To imagine him arranging an ambush with such artifice was quite out of character. Rowley gave a grunt that might have been gratitude. Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Lawson, too, had reason. Pritchard had threatened her reputation, yet her methods are those of the drawing-room, not the quarry road. She would shame, belittle, perhaps ostracize, but not lure a man into darkness." Mrs. Lawson gave a stiff sniff, as though reluctant to be pleased. "A's for dear Clara," Miss Marple said gently. "She was afraid, yes. But it was a fear born of innocence, not guilt. Pritchard used her name as a weapon, knowing her timid nature would make her believe herself vulnerable. It was cruel. But cruelty, alas, was Pritchard's gift." The Clara's eyes filled with tears. Clement patted her hand kindly. "Which brings us," Miss Marple said, her voice firming, "to Mr. Riley. At first he seemed merely a jovial innkeeper, always ready with a word and a pint, but such men often hear more than they should. Riley knew everyone's business. He also had dealings, I believe, in less lawful enterprises. Poaching, perhaps even a little smuggling. Nothing grand, but enough to ruin him if exposed. Pritchard, nosing about for profit, discovered these dealings. He threatened Riley, hinted to Clara that he had damning proof. Riley, seeing his livelihood and liberty at risk, resolved to silence him. He wrote the note, lured Pritchard to the quarry road, and struck him down. Then, with misplaced cleverness, he planted Rowley's cufflink and discarded notebook to direct suspicion elsewhere. But here, as always, cleverness betrayed itself, for one cannot plant character, and it was not Rowley's nature to plot in shadows. It was Riley's. And when the fire consumed Pritchard's papers, it was Riley who was most anxious, for he had no idea what might have survived. In the end, it was a single charred scrap, bearing his name, that gave him away. A murmur ran through the room. "Mrs. Price," Ridley exclaimed, "I always said there was something shifty about that man. Mark my words, you can never trust an innkeeper." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, with the faintest twinkle, "though I have known many who were most respectable." Reactions and reflections. Rowley straightened, his face clearing of weeks of tension. "So I'm cleared, then. Thank heaven for that. I'd begun to think no one would believe me." Inspector Slack nodded gruffly. "You've a hot temper, Rowley, but no. This one wasn't yours." Mrs. Lawson rose, her pearls clinking faintly. "If you ask me, it proves one cannot be too careful in one's associations. I shall certainly take more care in future whom I admit to my home." Griselda Clement, with her usual candor, said, "But you admitted Pritchard often enough, didn't you, Mrs. Lawson?" "Only until he stopped flattering you." Mrs. Lawson colored, muttering about impertinent remarks, while the room rippled with subdued amusement. Clara, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into herself. "If only I had spoken sooner," she whispered, "perhaps none of this would have happened." Miss Marple leaned towards her kindly. "My dear, you must not reproach yourself. You were deceived, as many are, by fear. It is a common trick of wicked men, to make others believe themselves guilty when they are not. But truth has prevailed, and you are free of it now." But Clara's lips trembled into a small, grateful smile. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack, after the gathering had broken up, and villagers spilled into the cool evening with their tongues wagging at fresh speed, Inspector Slack lingered behind. He looked at Miss Marple with something almost like respect. "You've got the better of me again, Miss Marple. I dare say I'd have kept chasing Rowley round in circles if not for you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, Inspector, you underestimate yourself. You had all the pieces. You merely needed a little nudge to arrange them. I have found that the truth is often like a pattern in knitting. One drops a stitch here, another there, and suddenly the whole thing looks wrong. But once you notice the error, the design is plain to see." The Slack shook his head in bemusement. "You and your knitting. I'll never understand how you do it." "It is all practice," she said mildly, "and a good deal of observation. People, like stitches, have their own patterns, if one cares to notice them." Closing calm, the following days brought the quiet restoration of village life. Riley was removed to the county gaol, his inn taken over by a distant cousin. Rowley returned to his fields with renewed vigor, and Mrs. Lawson found a new object of scorn in the postmistress's niece. Clara Evans walked with a lighter step, her dignity restored, and Dr. Haydock remarked with satisfaction that her health seemed much improved. For Miss Marple, life slipped gently back into its familiar rhythms. She sipped her tea, tended her roses, and clicked her needles by the parlor fire. Yet she knew, as she always knew, that beneath the peace of St. Mary Mead lay the eternal churnings of human folly and frailty. Sooner or later, they would break the surface again, and when they did, Miss Marple would be ready. Seemingly a simple old lady with her knitting, yet with eyes that missed nothing, ears that caught every tremor, and a mind that saw always the truth hidden beneath the most ordinary of village days.